Sarah Parks, you can go ahead and start the live stream, I think, if you're ready. Oh, never mind, she's on it. Thank you. So we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes for our presentation. We have Greg Olson and Lance Foster here, as well as Jackie Lewin from the Oregon California Trails Association. We're going to be talking about the Iowa Tribe today, and resiliency and sustainability during these interesting times. If you're joining us on the Zoom, a couple of things, please let us know where you're coming from. We like to see that. I also would encourage you, if you have questions, to leave those questions in the chat as we're going through the presentation. We're going to have everyone muted during the talk, and then we'll have some time to answer questions at the end. So if you just go ahead and type those questions in the chat, we can go through them as we get to the end. Also, for those of you who are joining us on Facebook, if you want to type your questions in the comments, we will ask them of Greg and Lance and try to address those as well. So welcome to all of you on the Zoom, as well as all of you who are joining us live on Facebook. I'm Sarah Wilson, and the Executive Director of the St. Joseph Museums. Will be starting in just 1 minute.
Excuse me, Sarah.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see that it's coming in on my Facebook page. I'm not seeing that so that I can share that. Can you give me a hint?
Sure. I'm looking right now. It is on the St. Joseph Museum Facebook page. So if you go to our St. Joseph Museum Facebook page, Jackie, you should be able to find that link and share it.
Okay, I see it. I see it.
Very good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I see that we have lots of people jumping on, but it is 1:30 and I like to be prompt. My name is Sarah Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Joseph Museums. And I'm actually joined today with Jackie Lewin, who is our former director and an amazing human being. And I've been so fortunate to follow in her footsteps. And she is the current president of the Gateway chapter of the Oregon California Trails Association. And she had asked us to partner with them to put together a presentation with Greg Olson and Lance Foster. Lance and Greg had given a presentation at Highland Community College, probably around last year this time, perhaps.
Yeah, last November.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a really good presentation. And we kind of wanted something that was similar to that we could share more broadly in a virtual format right now. And so we are joined today with Lance Foster, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. He is also the current vice chair of the tribe. And Lance is also the author of The Indians of Iowa, is a book that he has authored, as well as many other works that he's done, continuously doing research, and a wonderful person. Welcome, Lance. Did you want to say a few words?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I'm gonna put him on the spot. And then we're also fortunate to have Greg Olson, who is an independent scholar.
Independent scholar, that's right.
He says he was the curator of exhibits and special projects for the Missouri State Archives for, I think, Greg, 19 years, is that
19
correct?
years, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and he's also the author of The Iowa in Missouri.
Shameless plug. Here we go. There's that. And
Iowa Life, yes.
Iowa Life, yeah.
Those are the two that you went to. Do you have the copy of Great Walker with you? Or no, that's not yours.
It is mine, yeah. Also, right, the books on Great Walker and Jeffrey Derenay.
Yeah.
but I don't happen to have, these are just what were on the bookshelf handy. So yeah, I'm terrible at promoting myself. So I need to be more prepared with that, but yeah. Yeah, I've been working on researching and writing about the Ioways, I guess, for 25 years maybe. And that's how I met Lance. I think Lance and I have been communicating about Iowa history for maybe 20 years, Lance. It's been a while anyway. So anyway, I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you, and we're very fortunate to have your years of knowledge. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then we can kind of get into the presentation that we've put together. Everybody seeing that okay? Yep, okay.
Yeah.
So after I left the conversation that you guys presented in Highland, one of the things that really struck me is the lessons that we can learn from the Iowa today. And those lessons in my mind have a lot to do with sustainability and resiliency. And so that's kind of the topic of this, is kind of looking at the history of the Iowa and thinking about how we can learn from their history, and how does that move us forward to our present times, and how do we plan for the future with that. And I think you both are very knowledgeable on this topic, so let's just go ahead and get started. So either one of you probably know the sort of the history of, you know, where the Iowa came from and the homelands. And so Greg or Lance, jump in and
Actually, I'll jump in because I have a question for Lance about this. So the story that we usually hear about the origins of the Iowa is that they came from a place that they call Meashujay, which is around Green Bay, Wisconsin. Red Earth is what that means. And I wanted to ask Lance. Lance, recently in some research I've been doing, I was reading a book by Louis Burns, who was Osage and a historian, and he mentioned something about the Ioways migrating to the Mississippi Valley down the Ohio River with the Osages and the Degian Sioux, that the Joere Siouan people and the Degian Siouan people maybe originated, rather than the western Great Lakes, maybe more in the southern central Great Lakes. And I wanted to know if you'd ever heard anything about that. That was a new one for me.
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to address the idea of multivocality, which is every tribe kind of has its own story. And it's hard, like, for example, you hear about one tribe coming from this area or that area, and then you'll hear about another tribe that says, no, we were there when you appeared there. So
right.
I first of all want to say that every tribe has a right to its own story and its own version of things. And sometimes even within tribes, there are going to be multiple versions of things, just like, you know, back in the Southwest, the Kivas often don't communicate their own kind of ways. The clans were the same way. The clans originally, they had their own stories, they had their own origin stories, and they generally didn't share it with the other clans originally. So the thing that I see is that you have to go back in time. So the Iowa, Oto, Missouri people and the Ho-Chunk, or some call them Winnebago people, kind of come from the same roots. All our traditions tend to indicate that we did a kind of a final separation from each other around the year 1500. And around the year 1500, there were a lot of pressures coming from tribes from the east, especially the Algonquian tribes kind of moving up around the Great Lakes. There was also epidemics kind of going through the area and all that sort of stuff. So the Iowa, the Oto, Missouri, and Ho-Chunk languages are very, very similar. Sort of like the difference between, say, Texans and New Yorkers. So it's very understandable, but there might be some terms that are different, some pronunciations that are different, very similar. And we all share that point of view that we were all one people at one time. And then it's gradually separated for different reasons. There are different traditions about why we separated. And that would have been up around the upper Mississippi that happened. You go back a little further than that, and you're talking about when the Mississippian people, the upper Mississippian people. So you have the upper Mississippian people that seem to have emerged out of the woodland people of the Upper Mississippi, that's what they call them, Upper Mississippian, the Middle Mississippi people, which would be more the Yeehaw people, including the Osage, the Quapaw, the Ponca, the Kansas, and forgetting somebody, Greg, who's the other one? There's 5 of them. But anyway.
Cause, or you already said that? No,
I thought I did. But anyway.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
So the best indication, and you're dealing with oral traditions and you're dealing with history, and your history as written isn't going to go back further than some of the explorers that brought the written part of that into it. And by 1685, the French were already seeing us up there on the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
I think there might be some memories going on there of the time when we were all part of this kind of Mississippian culture that was up and down the Mississippi River. The northern people, which would have been us, Winnebago, Oto, Missouri, and then further north of us, some of the bands of Sioux, Midway-Canton maybe, and some others up as far as St. Croix. That would have been in the upper Mississippi. The middle Mississippi, that was a kind of a multi-ethnic community, Cahokia. And the Osage and some of the others seemed to be more in Cahokia at that time period, especially the 1400s, I think is about when that was florescent. And then they kind of split up and they kind of moved over into kind of northern Missouri and into Kansas a little bit. So as far as the idea that we split off from the Yeehaw people, I don't see that our traditions support that. What I see instead is that we do have a common ground, not only in the Mississippian culture that was going on in the Mississippi Valley, but it was very distinguished. It was very different, but there was probably trade going on and visiting at times probably. But as far as coming down from the Ohio River Valley, that is going way, way back, probably into the late Archaic, maybe early Woodland period. And that's about the same time that all the Siouan tribes, from the Crow to the Dakota to all those, and again, we're talking about what archaeology shows, not what our individual oral traditions might show. But there was a commonality of language probably coming out from the Virginia Piedmont and into the Ohio River Valley. That seems to have been kind of a incubator for some of the Siouan languages. I mean, some of the terms that are similar come from that kind of area. And after that, we all kind of went our own ways as best we can tell. So I would say that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I think Burns was talking maybe before the Mississippian period. But it's interesting,
Yeah, I think the Hopewell period, for example, we're talking about the Woodland period for the Hopewell people, some of the mound builders and stuff. I'm sure that I know that there's North Farms, I think 36, showed that there was Iowa DNA in some of the individuals there. And that was in Wisconsin, but it was connected very much with the Hopewell people, which kind of were connected with Ohio.
So Lance, I'm going to jump in and ask a question about, it's been more popular now to, Okay, so it's been more popular now to do the DNA testing through Ancestry and things like that. Has the Iowa tribe been doing much of the DNA testing to kind of look at origins and connections, or, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very tricky question too, because people feel very differently about doing that. Some are very much, you don't do that. You don't mess with the dead. You don't do these things. Some of these studies were done before tribes had much of a say in it. It's kind of in kind of a holding pattern for most people now. So these reports were done back in the late 80s, early 90s, and so that sort of thing doesn't happen much anymore. As far as DNA, we know the Anzac site up in Montana shows that there's a lot of connections with even Asia, with other places, and of course some tribal people are going to, not hold to that, not agree with that. One thing that's important to know about DNA, I know it kind of comes from people's interest in trying to see if they have Indian ancestry in their past. A lot of people, family traditions have that. Sometimes the DNA can show whether you have, Native American blood way back there somewhere. But there's a difference between having that blood and being a member of a tribe, because one thing is biological, but being a member of a tribe is not only cultural, but political. And that is why, even though we may have links, if you're not a member of a tribe and recognized as a member of a tribe, then you can't come up with DNA and say, I'm going to be a member of a tribe. That's not how it works. Tribes have their own membership criteria, and they enroll people separately, differently. It usually comes from having a descendant of some kind, whether it's a mother, father, whatever, who enrolls you for the tribe. But every tribe has its own standards on what the requirement is.
One of the things that I found very interesting from the conversation in Highland, Kansas, what's your total tribal membership right now?
Well, total it's north of 4,000. And
at the lowest point in the Iowa history, how low was the tribal membership?
It varied between 150 to 300.
Yeah, I was going to say when the tribe split to go down, part of them went to Oklahoma. I think there were less than 100 in Oklahoma and less than 100 in Kansas.
Right.
Excuse me. So it was very low.
Yeah, and I think that's an amazing story to think about. Having a tribal membership that was so low at one point, and now to have been able to grow that back is an amazing story of resiliency. So we should probably talk about the split between the Oklahoma tribe and the Iowa and Kansas. Did you want to maybe share with our listeners kind of what happened there? Why is it split? Why are there two Iowa tribes on different reservations?
I guess, okay, so right before that happened in the 1870s, and Iowa of Oklahoma got their reservation confirmed by executive order, I think it was in 1883. Right in the 1870s, when people were moving south, right before that was the Civil War, right? And during wars, men come home and they're going through a lot of stuff. They're trying to figure things out. They're trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives. They've seen things that people at home can't believe that they've seen. We know that some of the men that came home after the Civil War, and it's important to notice that the Iowa people, the Iowa men, the greatest proportion of them served in the Civil War in the Union cavalry and infantry, right, Greg? I think Greg knows more about the particulars on that. He's done
most of them were in the 14th Cavalry, but there were probably about 17 or so that were in the infantry that were the first to sign up. And they served in Oklahoma too. I mean, they were, almost all of them were active in that, around Fort Smith, and so in that Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas. So they knew that country when they got back home.
So that's probably where you hear the story about when they went back and they said, there's still game down there, guys. Mm-hmm. There's places we can still hunt. We can still live like Indians down there. Part of what was going on up here was there was continuing pressure from non-Indian settlers to get more and more of the land. I mean, we had lost the land several times. It was unremitting pressure to get those Indians out there and give us that land, that farmland. The Indians just waste that farmland. Yeah. But we were farming too, but they just wanted the land. So there was this pressure between what they had seen in the service in the Civil War and that the tribes they knew, Sac and Fox and others in Oklahoma, were still able to live in villages, much the same old way, kind of doing the things that they were used to. And all this pressure up here and all the disaster and epidemics and stuff that happened up here, I think there was a good proportion that just wanted to go where they could be Indian, and not always having to face all this stuff up here all the time. It seems like the split it tended to be the more full-blooded ones went south to live in that kind of communal way, but there were mixed bloods that went there, and there were full-bloods that stayed up here too. So the division seemed to be more with the way you wanted to live your life. Down, the ones that went there wanted to live in the old traditional way as best they could. And the ones up here said, well, we have to accommodate the situation and we're going to keep what we can. But they were attached to the places they had developed as homesteads, as homes, as cabins, especially the women. The women put together a petition to say, we don't want to go. You know, the chiefs, except for a few, had voted to go down south. But then I think it was Tom Lightfoot talked with women, and they got a petition together, and they said, no, we don't want to go. We developed all these places, and we don't want to go that we want to do this. So Greg may have a few things to add too on that.
Well, and what's interesting about that too is that split was pretty much 50-50, right, Lance? That about half the tribe went down to Oklahoma. They like you said, the Sac and Fox, who they had a long-term relationship with, not only the ones they shared the agency with or the reservation with, but the Sac and Fox, when they went down there, the Ioways actually shared the Sac and Fox reservation in Oklahoma for a while. And, you know, it was interesting how first a small group went down to Oklahoma, and then they must have liked it because it seemed like it was a trickle of Ioways moving down there for a period of maybe 5 years or so, maybe less than that. But, and so, yeah, to stay in Kansas, those Ioways would have been more committed to sort of Euro-American style agriculture, you know, and then like you said, Lance, the people who moved down to Oklahoma.
There was also a part of it too, which is 1837 when Nohart did his map trying to refute the Indian land claims. He said, you know, the proof of our having been here are all these graves or all these places where we lived, our sites and stuff, and those graves of the forefathers are what make that place ours. And so continuing that same kind of thinking, we're very much attached to our ancestors. And so another part, people didn't want to move from here. There's a lot of burials up here. There are a lot of graveyards and stuff, and they didn't want to abandon their graveyards to strangers.
And you know, Ioways had been removed how many times? They'd had to move out of Missouri into what was then the Platte Purchase, and then they were told they could stay there. Then they had to move across the river to the reservation they have now. And that was all within, you know, 1 generation, 2 generations memory. So people remembered that. They remembered how they'd been uprooted 2 or 3 times. And I've run across different letters and testimonies where Ioways just said, no, you know, we're not moving anymore. And their tenacity in keeping that land, I think, is part of the reason that reservation still exists today, when so many others, like so many other nations were moved to Oklahoma and the reservations were disbanded.
So let's step back a little bit and look at this picture. This is by George Catlin, and it's probably from the 1830s, I would say. As a museum professional, I'm very interested in the material culture, and some of the most interesting conversations I feel that I've had with Lance is looking at the change of dress over time. You know, sometimes we get this notion that, you know, Native American people, you know, they were always this one particular way. They always wore these particular clothes, but looking at the change of the culture over time is really interesting. And so some of those earlier paintings that we've seen, Lance, you've studied those and been able to identify individuals who were painted, as well as kind of the change in dress over time. So do either of you want to talk about the people in this painting and how the paintings came about and what we know from this particular painting?
Is this from, go ahead, Lance.
No, go ahead. I'll finish up.
Well, I was going to ask, is this from before they went to London, before the Ioways?
This is when Catlin saw him down by Fort Leavenworth.
Okay, before that time, because Catlin, he traveled up the Missouri River and was making sort of a catalog of paintings he was painting as many different Native people as he could. He'd been a lawyer, you know, who lived in Pennsylvania, I think is where he grew up, and wanted to go out to the Wild West and become an artist. And he did, and he had a really good eye for detail, and he was very prolific. I mean, he did hundreds and hundreds of portraits. And so he went past, the first time he met Ioways is probably, I think, in 1833, 34, something like that, when he first made his trip up the Missouri River. And so maybe, Lance, this was painted then. And then about a decade later, then he had 14 Ioways come to London where he was doing a show. So between the paintings he did before and the paintings he did in the 1840s, we actually have kind of a nice catalog of portraits done by George Catlin of Ioways. This looks to me like probably it was done, maybe it's a colored etching or something, maybe that was done for one of his books, his publication. It has a little less detail than some of his paintings, but yeah, he knew a lot of the people, and like I said, he had a really good eye for detail.
Lance, why don't you tell us what you know? So when I pulled this painting up, I had no idea how to identify the individuals in the painting. So that was one of the questions I asked of Lance is, can you identify these particular individuals? And Lance, you were able to give us some thoughts on that?
Well, these guys are basically pictured in this book. Mm-hmm. Originally, they were done as separate individuals, etchings or lithography, whatever they were. He did as sketches mainly to begin with.
Yeah.
And then later he grouped these three together. There's actually another person that he had drawn as well at the same time. So as far as me being a magic guy, they can like come up with, who these guys were. I have a source. So the guy on the left, Father Cucci, so he was, you see, has a club there, the Gunstock War Club, and they all have, Iowa style was not generally to be a long hair person with the braids. That came in later, maybe with the kind of a pan-Indian kind of a style. Originally, we were more like the Omahas and the Pawnees and all those guys in this area, which were connected with the Eastern Woodlands, kind of an Iroquoian kind of a hairstyle with basically very short cropped hair with the braid, the braid scalp lock coming down, which is where the seat of the soul was. A lot of times they did wear bands around their heads. Sometimes it was fur, sometimes it was cloth. Most of these look cloth, except the guy on the right looks like German silver. And some of those were for not only when you're working hard to keep the sweat out of your eyes, but they seem to also be kind of a defense against club strikes, kind of like a helmet almost. The red deer tail, tatine, also, porcupine hair, guard hairs and stuff were used on them, depending on, who made them. But they were red. They kind of symbolized the connection with the sun and the woodpecker, who is a kind of a bird of the sun, a solar bird. And it showed when you were up like that as a warrior, we wore those rather than the headdresses of the Northern Plains, because that showed that you were angry and you were ready to go to war. Just like a woodpecker, when he's angry, gets his roach kind of up and ready to go. The guy on the far right, of course, has a pipe, and the Iowa were guardians of the Pipestone Quarry from before 1700, and before we were kind of edged out with some of the tribes, domino effect kind of going across the Northern Plains there. The guy on the right, I think that pays no attention. No, his name was Good Sense, man of good sense, Wayin Wayu, and Wayin means mind. Yeah, there's a lot of words in our language that either passed from use or are hard to decipher from some of the spelling inherited from before. People kind of spelled randomly because we didn't have a system of spelling. Yeah. And people still argue about spelling anymore anyway. So right. Spelling's difficult. The guy in the middle is kind of a riddle, because on the one hand, Callan identified him as White Cloud, the son of a man of the same name, present chief of the Iowa tribe, also known as No Heart. And that's hard to figure out, because No Heart actually was his uncle. No Heart was White Cloud the first brother and uncle to White Cloud the second. This looks like a younger man, So I'm kind of thinking, because Catlin kind of focused on it being the chief, I think maybe he misheard. So I'm kind of thinking this was more than likely White Cloud. Plus, in the 1840s, when Catlin hosted them or kind of traveled with them over in Europe,
Right.
he knew White Cloud pretty well. So I'm thinking this is White Cloud the second rather than No Heart. And you can see the buffalo robes that they had, that by the time I think our last buffalo hunt was like 1857 or so, because it was just too far away anymore. So I think these would be some of the last, say, traditional wear, pre-reservation clothing. And we'll see an example later after, all the hides, all the game is kind of killed off, all the people coming in, smashing to smaller and smaller places, all the game's kind of disappearing. And so this is kind of the last gasp of the pre-contact kind of clothing that we would have had.
Thank you. I'm going to go on down. Here in St. Joseph, Joseph Robidoux is known as the founder. He comes to the area in the early 1800s, and he's primarily an Indian trader. He trades with the Indians for furs. So Lance or Greg, either of you, did you want to kind of go into the connection between Joseph Robidoux and the founding of St. Joseph and the Iowa tribe, and what did that look like? How does that history look?
I can probably take a swing at that. The thing about trade is that especially French traders figured out pretty early on that it was good for business if you, over the winter, they would live oftentimes with some of the nations with whom they were trading. And they'd actually, they would actually live in the villages, live alongside. And of course, often they would marry native women, in part because it was good for business. Joseph Robidoux, for instance, married White Cloud's daughter, or it was called a country marriage. They used to call them country marriages. Robidoux had a family in St. Louis, but while he was out in the field, he would establish relationships with native women, because if you could have a country marriage with a daughter of an important person, then that was really a good connection to have in the tribe. It gave you, as a trader, an inroad into the tribe for business, but it also enhanced the family, the Iowa family within the tribe, because if you were related to a French trader, then you had a direct conduit to business. And this is part of, I think Lance touched on it earlier, kinship, where I think in Native culture, there was a lot of kinship, relationships were formed, and it was like, you'll become my relative, my hunka is what the Lakotas call it. And, I'll have your back and you have my back. We're family, even though we came from different parts. So pretty quickly then Robidoux became related by blood to the Iowais. And then, of course, Robidoux's daughter ended up marrying the second White Cloud. I made a mistake earlier and I said that he had a relationship with one of White Cloud's daughters, but I'm at the risk of getting this all mixed up. We don't know the woman with whom Robidoux had a relationship with, but Robidoux's half French, half Iowa daughter did marry the second White Cloud, so that he had a really close relationship with that family. One of the things I found, I've been going through a lot of the treaties now, and the Platte Purchase Treaty was interesting because Joseph Robidoux was there as a witness when they signed this treaty. Frank White Cloud, or White Cloud II, was one of the signatories to that treaty. So I kind of wonder, by that time they were already related by blood, and I kind of wonder, as they sat as adversaries kind of on separate sides of the treaty table, what were the dynamics there? It would have been really fascinating because, of course, White Cloud was not terribly obviously excited about signing away the Platte Purchase, and Robidoux stood to gain financially a lot if he could get the plat purchase to go through, because of course the future site of St. Louis or St. Joseph and his trading post was in that. So it's an interesting kind of, I don't know if I want to use the word incestuous, but you know, blood kinship was good for business, but it also kind of made for some really complicated relationships. Lance, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, it's good.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, so St. Joseph really, when he formed that town, and I think a lot of the reason, you know, the plat purchase was not originally part of the state of Missouri. The old Missouri state line went straight north from Kansas City up to Iowa. And that was originally supposed to be what they called an Indian territory. And a lot of people in the state of Missouri were looking to places like Roubidoux trading post on the Missouri River. And they thought, you know, it would be economically a really good deal if Missouri could get that land and annex it into the state, which they did in 1836. And of course, the Ioways, along with the Sac and Fox and some other nations, were signatories to that. And so that was the second time the Ioways were removed because of a treaty.
Yeah, and the whole situation, I think Joseph Ruby was an incredibly complicated human being, as most of us are. You know, he had these extramarital relationships or a second marriage with Iowa ladies. There's a lot of complications, I think, with the dynamics of the women of the Iowa tribe and marrying into the European settlers, you know, for economics, and you know how much agency they had in those decisions, or whether those were things that they were kind of made to do. Lance, maybe at some point we could talk more about that. I don't know, because we'll talk about Kurz. And then certainly Joseph Roubidoux is important in this conversation because he also was a slave owner.
Right.
Jeffrey DeRoyne came to the area with him, and he'll turn up later too as Joseph Roubidoux's slave. So we'll move on to this next slide and let you guys talk about the interesting trip to Europe, and maybe Jeffrey DeRoyne and Catlin's relationship with the Iowa tribe and all of these things.
So for a long time, I thought that the man on the far right was Catlin, but actually that's not. That's
Mary.
Melody, right? Mr. Melody, the guy who was one of their chaperones, I guess, through Europe. And then the second one over is this Darnay, Jeffrey, and as far as I know, that is the only only image we have of him.
People,
and Lance, you probably know the others.
I was just going to say, people here generally, I mean, there was a lot of different ways they spelled his name, Dora Way, all these others.
Right.
I think people here generally say DeRoyne in general.
Yeah.
But you know, there's a lot of ways to talk about. Now, these are not all the ones went. There was supposedly a party of 14. You don't see Corsair, who was the baby born on the steamship before they went over there. But you see a lot of people. The guy on the far left, for example, we generally, like I said, didn't have headdresses. This guy stands out. This is blistered feet, Sinodea, which means sort of like he went a long ways, and so far his feet got blistered, like on the warpath. So medicine people did go to war back then. And so that's Sinodea, the doctor. And you have Nahomunian, pays no attention. You got White Cloud back there. You got a lot of the people and Wataway Buchanan, the young boy there, and Sophia, or Sophria, some say, Tapatami, the wisdom, the little girl there. So these are all different people who traveled in they were there from 1844 to 1845. It started earlier, of course. And their entire journey has been interest to me since the 1980s when I found out about it. In fact, at one time, I wanted to kind of retrace their footsteps in Europe and kind of compare what they saw and what's there now. That was always a dream of mine as a young man. One of our tribal members, Sarita McGowan, has traveled over there because Corsair, the little baby, 3 of these people died over there, apparently of consumption. or tuberculosis, and the air is very dirty over there. There's a lot of disease and everything. So 3 of these people never came home. There was one woman who died from Okiwimi. She died. The first one was Roman Nose, and he was White Cloud. No, it was Little Wolf's buddy, kind of a war friend. He is buried somewhere in Scotland. I think it was, or North Shields. Then Corsair was buried in, I think it was in France, in London. And then, God, you remember Greg? Anyway, I think he's buried in England, because I found where his burial was, and we've been trying to think about repatriating this baby to come back home. We did repatriate one student who died in the Carlisle back east last year, I think it was, and we brought him home. Henry Jones was his name. And we've been trying to find ways to bring our people home, because they always wanted to be buried in their own land. And then, of course, Okiwimi was Little Wolf's wife. So his best friend, his baby, his wife, all died on that trip. Little Wolf. And in the Indian way of thinking, they'd be like, why him? What happened with him? Why was he the one that was targeted like that? Because before, the thing that made them decide to come back home was they had a dream about one of the spiritual people that came up from under a basket in a bridge, and this this lady said, some things are coming after you. Something's coming after you. And that was part of that whole drama of Little Wolf turning in certain people that had tried to kill Big Elk, the Omaha. And all these things were going on. And there's always unseen portions to all these dramas that were going on. And they reverberate through family lines even to today. So these people went over there to try to make some money performing, to bring back money home, because things were so hard here. They went over there, and they ended up giving away most of their money to poor people there. And when they come home, big trunk full of Bibles, and people kept on trying to convince them that the Indian way was wrong and the Christian way was. And they were like, they already had missions here. They already had like the Presbyterians telling them all that. And they're like, no, you've never heard about the word. It's like, yeah, we did. Please just leave me alone. So it was a complicated deal, but that's a little bit about 1844 to 1845. And these guys
And I would just add too that anybody who's interested in, I think that Catlin narrative about that trip is pretty fascinating, because Catlin traveled with the Ioways for so long, and he knew them pretty well, and so he was able to give readers a sense of what the Ioways saw and how they viewed the French and the English, when they were in Europe. Usually when there's an Osage book about Osages visiting Europe, and there you just get what did the Europeans see. But I think Catlin's book is really valuable because he's able to convey some sense of how the Ioways saw the Europeans, and it wasn't terribly favorable. It's a good read.
It is, and I've got that over there on the left, if anybody wants that as a reference. Catlin's notes of 8 years travels and residence in Europe, and it is a really excellent book, and gives a good history of that trip. So let's move on down to the next slide. This is Rudolph Frederick Kurz, and he's coming through the St. Joseph area, 1847, 40. It says here 1846 to 1852, but I think he's actually in St. Joseph 1847 and 48 and 49 too, because I know he's here during those gold rush years. And the St. Joseph Museums, we actually just recently did an exhibit at East Hills Mall, where we visited some sketches of Rudolph Kurz in the St. Joseph area, and I had asked Greg and Lance to come over and consult on that. And I don't know, guys, either of you can share what your thoughts are, what we learned from Kurz's trip and his sketches about the Iowa tribe.
I guess I would say Lance is probably going to mention this too, but it's interesting to compare these Kurz drawings and paintings with the Catlin's. I think, and we talked about this last year when we were looking at the exhibit about how Kurz seems to be more idealistic probably because he was a much better trained artist than Catlin was. Catlin was just sort of an amateur who picked up a paintbrush and through hard work, was able to become really good, but he also didn't carry a lot of that academic baggage alone. And to me, to my eye anyway, just even looking at this picture right here, Kerr seems to, I mean, this almost looks as much like a Roman god or a Greek god as it does a Native American. I don't know, Lance, what your thoughts about it are?
There's that same kind of neoclassical time period.
Yeah,
when they're trying to idealize Greco-Roman culture and everything. One thing that's important to note here too is notice that their clothing is switched to cloth. And that loss of game just in those 10, 15 years from the 1830s until now, we're talking about the early 1850s. People didn't have the access to hides and stuff that they did at one time. This is supposed to be white cloud. And notice his hairstyles turned into a pompadour type hairstyle. And you've looked at some of the old daguerreotypes of Nohart as an older man, and his hairstyle turned into a pompadour kind of thing too. So it's important to remember it's a combination of this hairstyle, these clothing, the material culture you see. Indians were not frozen into one time period. Just like everybody else, there were styles that came in. They were like, oh, I'm into the red leggings now. I think I'm going to do that now. So there was things that came in, German silver, other kinds of things. You can see eagle bone whistle around his neck. You can see a quirt around his wrist. Quirts are some of the more common, the most noticeable Iowa material culture that still survives, made out of antler or bone sometimes. What's interesting to me in this one is that pot at his foot, because most people say that Iowa stopped making pots around the 1700 or so, but you can see clearly that has one there. And in fact, if you look very closely, there's a design that looks very much like some of the Oneota kind of styles that you will see on pots as well. There's a larger pot with a different kind of rim, and a smaller pot. A lot of the smaller pots have to do with burials and offering kind of pot. It's not made by kids. It's for specific offering kinds of purposes. So that's a very interesting one. And you will see later on by the 1870s and 1880s, that's when we start having all the very dark wool clothing, strouting and things with the curvilinear beadwork that starts once all the tribes start interacting in Kansas. So the styles were always changing.
So to put this into some context, so this is White Cloud, and this would have been after he came back from his trip to Europe. So this gentleman in this painting has also traveled and met the King of France and the courts of Europe, and he's back now in the St. Joseph area, which I think is really amazing, just to kind of contextualize that time period of how it's going. And so also this time period, Kurz writes about Western migration and the kickoff of the California gold rush and all of the settlers that are passing through. Also, Lance, isn't one of the ladies in this supposed to be Watahe, who was the lady that married Kurz? Yeah,
and that's an interesting name, because there's another name that's very similar called Witatai, which means here's pounding. And it's a particular lead family that had that right to that name. And it kind of reflects how they heard people making, an old man making a pipe up at Pipestone a long time ago. So that name kind of names go through clans and through families. And that's how it's passed down even today. And that young woman was the one that I guess Kurtz became enamored with. Her father, I think, was Neomani, were the one, because her father talked about his having gone over to Europe and talked about his interaction there. And Kuruche was what they call him. Kuruche is what they call him there. But people did have several names. Anyway, it may be that, and her father was also noted as being one who was very business savvy, and even the missionaries and everybody noticed that Neomani was the one trying to always figure out how the money works for the white man, and pretty savvy on that kind of thing. So he saw it as a strategic alliance. Well, the young girl was like, wasn't having it, so she ran off. And that was kind of the end of that romance, really.
Didn't he want to get into business with Kurz too? Like I can't remember just what it was, but he wanted him to be his business partner.
Right.
Her father, yeah.
Yeah, Kurz was terribly brokenhearted. He was much enamored with Tahe, it seemed. But that's a very good source, the Journal of Rudolf Friedrich Kurz, if you want to hear and learn about that early history of St. Joseph.
When they were in the St. Joseph area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they would travel across the ice to get leavings off of the plants where they butchered hogs and things like that.
So here, there's a couple of significant portrait collections that give us an insight into the Iowa Indians in the 1800s. One is George Catlin's work. The other are what are referred to as the McKinney Hall portraits. And both of these portraits are of Mahaska White Cloud. And I thought it was interesting to kind of just put one person in the same kind of slide to see the comparison of what we can learn from the material culture and that.
These are two different, it's father and son. They're two different white clouds. The one on the right is the elder, and that's a etching or a lithograph that was made from a
Charles Bird King, I think.
Charles Bird King painting, yeah. And then this is the one on the left is a Catlin painting of the younger white cloud.
And I have the actual McKinney Hall on the next slide of him. So these actually aren't the same ones, which is confusing with White Cloud always.
It is.
So how can you tell the difference between the younger and the older? What's tipping you off there?
Well, I just know the pieces.
Right. Same way with me.
The original, I think, is in Gilcrease down in Oklahoma, which I've seen.
It is. Yeah.
And along with Moana Honga, Brait Walker, and all those guys. Real nice, but then you have to simplify things when you do a lithograph. So he's got the bear claw kind of claw sign on his face, the one on the right. And so that's how we know. We know because of the labels. I didn't know the by myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to this next slide. So Ranchi, how do you pronounce this, Lance?
Well, it would be Ruche is a pigeon. Wai is the fly. Waini is a little bird. Mi is a female suffix. So Ruche Waimi is how they actually say it. But people spoiled kind of things kind of weird and hinky sometimes. So that's what it means. A pigeon that flies that's female.
Okay.
And this is also an etching. This is done also from a Charles Bird King painting because she accompanied the elder White Cloud when they went to Washington in 1824 to sign the treaty of 1824 to cede the northern half of Missouri.
And she fell off. Well, when on the way back or something, she fell off her horse, and the younger one, the older one, the father came back to find her. She had been killed when she fell off her horse, and the younger White Cloud was there asking, crying for his mother, what happened to my mother. So that happened. Anyway, that's the story that goes with it.
So let's look a little bit closely at her dress. So what's going on here? So is this a calico pattern?
Yep. Yeah. And so, there was a lot of trade goods going on even back then. So, people of high style, people who are of a higher family or important family, they're going to want the latest and the best, So, you can bet more than likely the regular woman who was maybe of a family not advantage would still be wearing the old hide dresses back then. And it would be like, oh, I'm getting the high tone stuff, the Yves Saint Laurent stuff from France, and I'm looking good. So, it's the same kind of thing. I think that the people wanted to dress as best they could with the latest fashion. And that's what this was.
And remember too that this painting was done in Washington, D.C. It was not done on the reservation. And so when delegations of natives were brought to Washington, D.C., it was not uncommon for them to go clothes shopping at the government expense. And they were given clothes to wear, because a lot of times part of what they were doing was going out to public appearances and things, and they could dress, you know, in fancy European style clothing or in their own clothing. So I suspect maybe this is something also that maybe was bought for them while they were in DC, bought for her.
Yeah, and you said she had traveled to, was she on the trip to Europe?
I don't think so.
No.
Because
Okay.
she's the wife.
Well,
of the-
no, yeah, because she died. She on the way,
Right.
what Lance said, she died on the way home
Okay.
or soon after.
Okay. So let's tie this back, I guess, to Joseph Robidoux and this relationship with the Indian tribe.
And
Greg.
this is a woman I was meant to, on the woman on the left is the woman I was talking about earlier, who was Joseph Robidoux's daughter, with an Iowa woman, and married Francis Whitecloud.
And Lance, do you want to say anything about his armbands or the material culture that you see in this picture?
No, except for, you know, Indian people didn't see. I mean, we would say those are somewhat feminine bracelets, but the thing is that probably people were gifted things, and we heard about it in when Callan went to Europe, that a lot of the ladies would take, you know, bracelets off their own arm and put them on people's arms or rings or whatever. So these are probably just ones that his admirers had given him at various times and places. This is when he was still a hopeful young man, even before he went over to England, because they noted in the English that English period that he kind of became somewhat gloomy after seeing what was going on over there. And when he came back, this is him kind of progressive as an idealistic young man. And he goes over in his 30s, he comes back and he actually starts going to war and stuff. He doesn't want to be like, he doesn't believe in it anymore. He says, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out like an Indian, you know. He's gonna, you know, and that's when the missionaries started complaining about him, and the agent ended up, you know, relieving him of his station, so to speak.
Interesting. We have a couple more. Oh, something has happened. I'm sorry for that. Hold on just one second. See if I can get my screen fixed. Well, you can go ahead and let's talk about pneumonia and this slide as I'm working on getting this fixed.
Well, pneumonia was rainwalk. And Niu is it's raining. Mania is something moving across the landscape. Usually, you can be translated as walking, but could be as moving as well in a continuous manner. So he's that's one of the traditional names of the Eagle Thunder Clan, and he was a war chief for the Iowas, one of the war chiefs, and he went over to England with the rest of them, and it was his daughter. At least the best evidence right now is that was his daughter that briefly was betrothed or married or whatever to Kurtz, and he was a businessman, and he was pretty savvy. The missionaries noted him as having a very good mind and being kind of aware of what was going on. Now, this guy on the right, they're identified as Washkumani. He was also Jim, they called him, and he was over there. He was a kind of a wag, a scallywag. He was always joking around with the doctor. They both had like, people think Indian people, you know, if they don't know you, yeah, kind of standoffish, kind of like got to put on your face because you know what you're dealing with and you have dignity. But among friends, I mean, just joking all the time, always joking, you know. And so these guys were always joking. Catlin wrote down a lot of their, you know, interactions, teasing each other and goofing around. And there's a lot of these individuals that I've been working on for biographies of them. So we understand some of these people will change names over time. Yeah. And, you know, to find out more about when they passed away and what their ultimate fate was, that's so important for us to recapture our history. But we know a little bit about him, but we're trying to find out more.
Yeah. And then, here are, another series of prints, and we don't have to get into each of these individuals. But I think that you kind of get a good glimpse of what the material culture looks like, who these individuals are, and what we can learn from them. I don't know, Lance or Greg, do you have anything that you want to talk about with these particular
Just
gentlemen?
the fellow on the far right, Wanahanga, also known as Great Walker or Big Neck. He was actually, if you want to talk about the Iowas trying to find their way through what was happening, people always wonder, well, why didn't we fight like the Lakota did and everything? Well, we did fight. War of 1812 was our last fight against the Americans as a people. The biggest group of people went with the British, trying to keep the Americans out of our land. But we picked the wrong not the winning side in that case. And so in 1815, we made a treaty. Everybody made peace. 1824, the story is that kind of we got conned through interpretation and whatever misunderstandings. White Cloud was one person the United States recognized as, White Cloud the Elder, I'm talking about, as being, pro-American. So they wanted to recognize him as a head chief. But there was a significant faction under Monahanga who didn't want to move from Missouri, did not. And when he found out he had sold the land, he painted his face black for the rest of his life and refused to. He was, I think it was 1829, there was an incident where he had a fight with some of the local militia guys who wanted to kind of provoke trouble and get those Indians out of there. There was a misunderstanding, long story. Look under the Big Neck affair and you'll learn more about that. But the upshot was he was actually acquitted of murder of white people.
By white people,
Right, in a time when that would have been unheard of. It would have been unheard of, but it was a matter of jurisdiction, really, and they had to acquit him. And he refused still to move over on the reservation. He and his band, there was a final battle, him and Little Star, who fought the Yankton Sioux, who were still fighting us. And the Yankton chief and Big Neck supposedly died in hand-to-hand battle, and they killed each other. And from that time forward, that's when we made peace with the Sioux, which we had been fighting up to about 1700 to about 1840s is when that was going on.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So let's talk about the reservation and the treaties and all of that. Who wants to jump on that?
This is Greg's map. Go for it.
Yeah, they're my maps. Yeah. So this is, okay, so after the Platte Purchase, then this is what the reservation originally looked like when the Ioways and the Sac and Fox were removed, I should say, into Kansas. So one thing I would say about that, you'll notice that the boundary between the Ioways and the Sac and Fox is kind of weird shaped. And so the Sac and Fox get this long, narrow band of land that stretches clear across there. And the reason for that is that the Ioways and the Sac and Fox, that of course the state of Missouri wanted them out of the Platte Purchase as soon as possible. They wanted white settlers. White settlers were actually already living there. So in the early spring of 1837, the Ioways and the Sac and Fox, or some of them anyway, moved over to the new reservation because they wanted to get some crops in the spring. And what happened is some of the Sac and Fox set up villages on the east side of the Wolf River, one of which was kind of not too far from the town of Sparks in Kansas, just sort of north and east of the town of Sparks. And then some of the Ioways set their villages up on the west side of the Wolf River. And no one had ever really bothered to survey it out until that summer. And then when Isaac McCoy, the surveyor, came, he had to somehow draw two equal land masses out of that reservation without once again uprooting and moving villages. So you have the Ioways then on the west side and the Sac and Fox on the east side, and then he drew that kind of, and then also I think it must have been, Lance, that the mission had already chosen its spot as well, because you'll see the land dips down to go right south of the mission.
It ended up where the mission building itself was
Right.
up on the Iowa land, but the barn and the farm part was more on the Sac and Fox.
Sac and Fox. And that's why if you look at a map of the road that goes east out of Highland right now and goes right next to the mission site, it's not on the square mile grid. It's like a half mile, or it's an odd road that doesn't really fit to the survey. And that's why, is because that road was there. That was the old boundary between the Iowa and the Sac and Fox reservations. But that's what it looked like. So that was what, I think they each got 200 square miles. And
yeah, if you look at that far kind of left corner of the Sac and Fox land, that's not far away from the present town of Hiawatha. It was roughly supposedly 20 miles from the point on the river straight west is what following the Kickapoo line was where the original idea was.
Okay, well, let's move on and look at how this changes over the history. So
yeah, so 1854, of course, that's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And there was, as Lance mentioned earlier, there was just a huge pressure from white settlers for, because several nations had been moved into eastern Kansas when they were trying to remove everybody from Missouri. You had the Kickapoos and the Shawnees and the Delawares and the Iowas and the Sac and Fox. And then as soon as Missouri was settled, then with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there was that same pressure. So in 1854, there's a treaty, and I think that the reservation is cut into half again. And then in 1861, there's another treaty, and that's the year, I think that Missouri, did Kansas become a state in 59 or 60? Anyway, it was not long after Kansas had become a state. And then the reservation, the Sac and Fox reservation, is completely disbanded, becomes settler land. And then the Iowas, if you look in the other map, the Iowas are forced to share what's left of their reservation with the Sacs and the Foxes. So you end up with a reservation that is about an eighth the size of its original size in just a matter of 25 years. But they held on to it,
So Lance, when we talk about the allotment period, can you go into what that is for our visitors?
Well, it's just done always the theme of getting the land from the Indians. So, you've seen sell off all your Aboriginal land, pressure for that. Now whittle down the forever home down into a little small as possible. That's still not good enough. People still want that land. So then the allotment idea was you divide it into certain amounts of acreage for individuals. So heads of household, if they're male, you got 160 acres. Females, heads of household, got 80 acres. If you're an orphan, you get 40 acres. So in our case, the reservation was so small, some people didn't even get land. So some people were left off the list, for example. And the idea there was to make sure the Indians become American. It's called assimilation, to make sure that we understand the value of individual land holdings and to not live in common in a village anymore, like they were still doing in Oklahoma, at least for a while. Then they got allotted too. But you got to make us into people that want money, want property, kind of the nuclear family idea, not the extended clan. And that was all that kind of focus on trying to divide that land up. And in many places, if there was excess land, then that would sell that land off to non-Indians. So there's checkerboarded all across these different places. In our case, it happened from 1887 to 1892, when people who even didn't want to do allotment were forced to. Some people ended up selling theirs and moving down to Oklahoma based upon the situation that was going on. But from 1892 until 1906, the original idea was for 25 years, you could own your land, trust land, divided out. Then you had to, if you were declared competent, you could even lose it earlier. Then was put into fee simple land, which you'd be taxed for, and you could do liens against mortgages, all that stuff, do good old American stuff. And then at that point, there was no reservation. The whole idea was to get rid of reservations, to make everybody just be like like regular white neighbors and farmers and stuff, and then get rid of that Indian problem. So that was the ideal. And from 1892 until 1930, over 90% of our land was lost in that way. People lost their land. Some of the local shopkeepers and stuff found ways to get people owing the money and stuff, so they'd have to sell it for taxes and stuff. So we lost 90% of our reservation. That little kind of pale gray part, that's all that was left. That was divided, and 90% of that was lost. So that's where we were at.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
That was always the story too, was to get to put Native people into debt, you know, because if they didn't have money, they had land. And it's interesting that, you know, that was going on up until 1930, because that was going on as long as there's been a United States of America. That was sort of the modus operandi.
So I have included a couple of examples of reservation style of clothing, which is the more beadwork and woodland style. Lance, do you want to talk about that, or Greg?
Well, I would say, I mean, Greg will probably have some good things to add on this, but you notice I talked about that change from cloth when you had white cloth standing there with a pot. You didn't see a lot of beadwork on that. You saw some ribbon work starting on some of the women's clothing, but this type of curvilinear, they call it curvilinear, prairie abstract, curvilinear floral styles, that seems to have really begun as the interaction of people like the Delaware and Shawnee and Iowa and Oto, Missouri, all these people in what was called Indian country. Indian territory was further south, Indian country. And this was a way to encode tribal knowledge and pass that on. These were individuals or families' designs that had things, plants, other items that were important to them and to their spiritual ways. That was a way to like hide your knowledge, but also pass it on to your future generations. Some of these things, we know what the symbols are. Some of them are still private to different families. That kind of colorful on black with outlined by the white outlines and beads, and the kind of the dualistic approach, the mirror form that talks about the above world, the dual forms of life. You know, the day and the night, the above and below, all those things. And you will see a man holding pipes with the buffalo skull, and you'll see your deer head below. On the other one, you'll see the horses and the American flag saying, we're good Americans too, you know, which we didn't even get citizenship as a group until 1924. So all these things are encoded languages. It's a visual language that we're trying to express here. And it spread as a style. It is still kind of our style that we're known for. A lot of tribes from Omaha down south into Oklahoma, same way. Little differences here and there, but they're family-owned kind of styles. Greg, you might want to have some things.
Well, actually, I have a question for you, Lance. Would these have come from pan-Indian, relations where they're trading ideas? Would these have come from Kansas, or would this have started in Oklahoma, do you think?
This would have been the 1850s and 1860s.
Okay, so it's before really Oklahoma.
So it was even before Oklahoma developed.
Okay.
Everybody sent down south.
No, I just love this stuff. Yeah. I don't really have anything to add, except I really like it. Yeah.
Yeah. And same for the moccasin.
One thing I mentioned about the bear claw necklace there, which is you can still see it in our casino. It was repatriated as an effort by our tribe. It was the claw necklace of White Cloud family that was repatriated to our tribe. Prairie grizzly claws, very long claws, as long as your finger, or even longer depending on your finger. And you can see on the sides of them even little tiny patterns, dots. They're very similar to the dots on quirts and things like that. That's otter fur wrap that would have been revived or replenished as the fur wore out. But that's a very old necklace, because prairie grizzly, basically disappeared with the coming of non-Indians. I mean, you can still find grizzlies way up in the mountains of Montana and stuff, but even Lewis and Clark didn't see grizzlies till they reached the Great Falls of Montana. So that's a really old necklace.
Yes, and I borrowed it from Gary Westcott's Glimpses of the Past page because he
And
had a
more than
nice.
one bear, because bears only have 10 claws, right? And so the back ones are smaller than
Yeah.
the bigger ones.
Yeah. And that's an item that has been repatriated to you, that bear claw necklace.
Right.
That,
If you're interested in seeing it, it's still in the Casino White Cloud, where it's kept under security conditions.
and this is a nice example of some Iowa moccasins, beaded moccasins. I do notice a lot of the pink beads. Is that something that was popular at a certain time period for the Iowa?
I mean, people who are into beadwork, they'll talk about greasy yellow. They'll talk about certain colors that were popular during time periods of manufacture, sizes of beads, all those things. Those are people who are into beadwork can really tell a lot about things based upon the colors, the types of beads, styles. I think this one is probably 1870s, 1880s, maybe. I am not as up on that as some, but it's a really good example of probably women's moccasins, I'm guessing, because of the bigger flap. But nice work, very nice, beautiful stuff. And each of those, now remember with plants, sometimes you're looking from different points of view. Sometimes you're looking at full on a blossom. Sometimes it's a profile look at the plant, like a leaf. Whatever helps determine the characteristics of the plant so it's identifiable to the people who notice these things. A lot of them medicinal plants, a lot of them sacred plants. So that sort of thing happens too.
Is there a way to identify Iowa beadwork? Like, I think you had mentioned one time that there's like a one white line around it, or sometimes there's two white lines.
I've heard that sometimes there's one white line or two white lines. People generally, most people that I know of, they can narrow it down to say this is more Iowa or Otoe, Missouri versus Omaha or one of the others. But I think it comes down to people who are really, and I think the older people who made these more frequently probably could have. But also these things were traded as gifts. So you might make something that was an Osage or an Otoe, and that'll end up in Iowa or Omaha hands too. These were either Iowa or, and they're very close to Sac and Fox sometimes too, who were very united with us in many, many ways for a long period of time.
Yeah, and you also have marriage between the tribes.
Right.
So, so what are you doing today? Working to, I know you mentioned you're doing some language work and preserving culture. So Lance, what's going on today with the tribe?
I think Greg can kind of chime in on this too, but language is a tricky thing. Language is something that you learn from your family growing up. That's your first language, right? So the first language of users of the Iowa and even Otoe and stuff, the first fluent speakers, in other words, I define that as somebody can talk in the language all day long and not have to break into English at all with another fluent speaker. That's how I define fluent. The last of those people who could do that all day long passed in the 1990s, and they were in their 80s and 90s. So the language has had a lot of materials from the missionaries, through Jim Good Tracks, through Otoe, Missouri, a language program. I mean, I have some videos online. We've all made efforts to try to preserve the language, but a language is part of a worldview, and there's an economic element to it as well. Usually most traditional cultures, the women are the ones who transmit that language. And in our tribe, it was kind of determined basically upon the way the boarding schools treated our people. They didn't want their kids beaten either. They didn't want their kids beat up and disregarded and made to feel small. So they didn't really pass on the language to younger generations. And it was a way for mom and dad to talk and grandma and grandpa to talk without the kids knowing what they're talking about too. But the kids learn, but there's a difference. There's a different skill in producing the language versus hearing and understanding it. You guys who have studied language, you might understand Spanish or French, but then having a conversation is a different skill entirely, a different skill level anyway. So we have had classes at various times. Different people have taught it. But the fact is, learning a language, especially for an adult, takes a lot of work and a lot of determination, a lot of time. Most people are not willing to do that, whoever they are, it takes time and work. You can make it fun, but some people don't think it's fun. So, and usually a lot of like people like the Hawaiians who brought a lot of their language back, they created like a language immersion programs. And you need a fluent speaker to do that, an elder or something that can speak that language all the time, and the kid absorbs that and they teach the kid. We don't have any fluent speakers yet left. So at this point, it's mostly about language awareness, trying to learn some of the basic phrases, some of the words, some of the singing, things like that. I mean, we're just trying to keep it alive, but it would take a real effort and commitment from tribes, 100% to have a hope of bringing it back.
One of the interesting things I think is when you go to the reservation, on some of your signs, they are in the Iowa language. That's
the awareness part. I mean, it's just to remind people that we have a language, that this is what the language looks like. This is what it sounds like. Because people often think, would you speak a Sioux language? No, it's Siouan, the way English is a Germanic language, but it's not German. You know, they're different. They have the same roots. They developed over the last 1,000, 2,000 years from the same roots, but they're not the same language. Iowa is not an Osage language. It's not Omaha. It's not Crow. It's not Hidatsa. All these languages are different. Just like English is not Swedish, it's not Norwegian, it's not, any of these languages, but they came from the same roots.
Mm-hmm. And so you also have a cultural center there on the reservation, community center, where you're trying to do some preservation of culture.
It started primarily, Bajoje Washkanchi is what we call it. Bajoje is what we call ourselves. Ba means snow, Joje means ashes or gray colored. Gray snow is often the most common way that people interpret that. And there's different stories about how that came to be too. But the thing is, I've had where we've studied, we've made drums here, we've made moccasins, we've done introduction to powwow clothing, we've had language classes, we've had where we actually read out loud, our myths and our legends to each other, so we would keep it alive, Right now, because of not only COVID, but because we have sensitive objects that we have to take care of, it is more of an archival thing. But we are trying to find ways to revive that. We've had to even cancel our powwow this year because of COVID. We've had to rethink a lot of this. All I know is sometimes you gotta keep it on respirator, ventilator. Oh geez, don't want to do that, do we? But anyway, we got to keep our language alive as best we can, even if it's whether it's like little kind of things like this, events, or whether it is writings, or whether it's during powwows or whatever. Just remember, language is just like culture. It's not static. Latin is a dead language because it didn't change. Well, kind of did change into French and Italian and Spanish. So that's not exactly true either. Our language is a sacred thing. It is one of the last things we have that is ours, distinctly makes us who we are instead of a pan-Indian kind of a group. And I always applaud and I always try to help anybody, whether it's to get exercises or speak with each other, just to make the attempts to keep it alive, But this is the Iowa Community Building built by the tribe from local limestone. And it's on the National Register of Historic Places. We put it on that. But it serves mainly as an archive and storage at this point. We are trying to make longer term plans. And exactly an exhibit that at various times, a timeline to kind of show the context and some of the items here. Sometimes, hopefully after this time, it's not open regularly because we don't have the staff for that. But if somebody wants to try to visit or whatever, after the pandemic is over, I welcome that. Right now we're trying to avoid exposure to each other because we don't want to be responsible for that, you know?
Sure. Yep. So you have a few other programs that you've started recently, and by recently, I'd say, what, in the last 10 years, maybe?
5 years even.
5 years.
Yeah.
So you have a regenerative agriculture program. And could you give us, I know at the Highland presentation, you talked a little bit about how that works with the partnership between the animals and the plants and.
Well, you know, I mean, part of the whole acculturation and assimilation process, trying to keep a part of who you are in the face of having to become something else economically. We took on from the horse and the plow to growing, instead of our native corn, beans, and squash, to taking on crops like wheat and building orchards and stuff in the 1870s, 1880s. We've had to keep up with the market economy. And so as part of that, originally we got into it with fur trade, right? Market economy, the world economy. Then it turned into farming agriculture, since we didn't have access to beaver pelts and things like that. And so we were also part of the industrial agricultural revolution, the green revolution, 1930s and 40s, to feed the world. Corn and soybeans rotation, that was the primary thing. And that's what people still kind of do here. Unfortunately, to make money at that anymore, you have to have a huge amount of acreage. You can't just do it on a small acreage that we have. And so between that and watching the land slowly die from the application of chemicals and the water nitrate level going up and everything, we're going to be here for another 1,000 years, hopefully. We're not going to be here if we don't take care of it. So in the face of a lot of opposition, much of it even local, we've had to look at another way to approach, to bring back the life of our land. And that means a regenerative approach. And that means integrating soil health, long-term cover, kind of using cattle grazing the way buffalo were intensive short periods that you cycle through the fields. So that's part of that regenerative agriculture that brings back the health of the land and be more of a focused micro markets on certain things and how are we going to survive here. Part of that has been the approval of the industrial hemp program, which this year is our first crop that we're working on that. So, and that will be focused into doing things like hempcrete houses and focused on a new product line that we're coming out, which is hemp-based cigarettes, things like that we're doing. But long term, the older than that even, this started maybe 5-6 years ago, was the Iowa Bee Farm. And as part of that understanding, and you see that picture, that's me and our former Vice Chair, Alan Kelly, walking through some of the Nature Conservancy blufflands, was the hope that by diversifying economically and bringing in pollinators and bringing in honey as a business, that maybe the chemical pressure would kind of lower and we could try to heal our land back while making honey and stuff. Now, we hit a really great event earlier, just a month or two ago, when one of the tribal members helped our bee farm go viral, and like we got 20,000 hits in one day. And so our honey operations really kind of been going up out the roof lately. So we're dealing with the bee farm. We're dealing, and you can go online and look at that website and order our Iowa honey locally. You can, we're doing products for industrial hemp. We're developing that this year. But we're also, as you can see, two other things that are kind of cool to talk about briefly. I know we're going long, but one is we're always been trying to buy our land back. We lost 90% of it. Sometimes we, through the casino, we were able to get some money back. We have a small casino, it's rural, it doesn't make the money some of the larger casinos make, but we try to buy land back for the tribe whenever we can, when it comes up for sale. We try to also bring back the land through deals like the Nature Conservancy donated some of its land back to us. The land that we're walking through is some of that kind of land like that, because it was designed for conservation. It is what Nebraska calls a biologically unique landscape with a lot of endangered species, threatened species, species that are quite rare. And so we're trying to bring our land back on that level too. We're kind of linked with Indian Cave State Park and across the river. All these places, we're like a little touchstone of what the original land was like. And it's been too rough, so it hasn't been developed, but some places are getting really developed. So that's returning the lost reservation land. And finally, the Iowa Tribal National Park, the Iowa Tribal National Park was designated this year. It's only the second one in the United States by that name. The first one was just a few years ago up in Red Cliff Band. I think it's called Frog Bay. And I think they had like 300 acres, and ours is going to be well over that. We have 2 units right now. We have the Leary site, which is over 150 or so acres of that 1,200 to 1,400 a village site, along with mounds. And then the other part, and so that's kind of the cultural side. And then we have the natural side, which is the Nature Conservancy lands that we're taking on and trying to manage it. That's going to be part of a larger vision to try to educate people not only about our history across the landscape, but also to bring health back to the land in a culturally appropriate way that helps our people.
Thank you, Lance, for sharing all of that. And I hope our listeners feel the same way that I do. But it certainly gives me a lot of hope. I think you have a lot of vision for moving forward in sustainable ways. And I think these are just amazing programs. And so I know it's a lot of work, but it's also so important. And I think it gives us a vision of a way to move forward sustainably as well. So thank you. We're kind of low on time, so we're going to open it up for questions. I have a couple questions that I thought I'd throw out there. We have the recent Oklahoma land ownership ruling from the Supreme Court. Is that going to have any potential on Iowa tribe?
You know, a lot of people either worry or are glad about it, but if you look at the case itself, it was one of jurisdiction for a particular tribe. I think it was the Creeks down in Oklahoma. And it was something that a little T hadn't been crossed and a dot hadn't been made on the finalizing some land deals there. So they found a loophole, and they're trying to use that loophole to deal with a legal case that they were dealing with regarding jurisdiction. I think it's so particular. It gives people hope, but I think it's so particular to that tribe situation. I don't know what kind of impact it will have, but I'll leave it to the lawyers to figure that one out.
And then, the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, just recently issued a broad statement about the use of the Chiefs mascot. And here locally, the Savannah Savages have been having a lot of conversations. The Washington football team has officially changed its name. It's a lot of things have been changing recently. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
it's a tricky one because the thing is, from a cultural point of view, objectification of any people or any race, any sex, anything like that, that just harms people, and it continues that kind of path of that's destroying the world the way it is. We made an effort to we had a creek here that people know as Squaw Creek, but originally before that, during the treaty, it was called Nolan's Creek. So that was easy enough. When I posted when we were putting up those sign names, right? I thought, oh, we don't. That squaw's not a word that we have. We didn't use that. Some of our older people, they inherited some of it, so they're kind of used to that term, and you don't see it necessarily as a bad thing. But talk about colonization of the mind, right? So a lot of us are still colonized. I myself, in a lot of ways, still. I think of an older kind of a sensibility, but younger people are leading us in a different direction, and younger people are the future, and they see things that we need to see as well. I hope we kind of respect each other. With this question about any kind of names, whether it's things like Squaw Creek, we're changing that name up in Iowa too, name, and they're going to honor us by calling it Iowa Creek is the last thing I heard. But then across the river there, Les Bluffs, was called Squaw Creek, and a lot of the people locally there were very invested in that name, and they didn't see it was wrong or whatever. But the problem is that, you know, when you talk to somebody, if you're trying to help them out, if they don't feel like it's an honor, if I call you a name like, hey Puffy, or something like that, and you know, maybe it's no big deal to me, but maybe, you know, you had asthma as a kid, and maybe you don't really like that name. Maybe it kind of makes you feel bad and makes you feel like, well, why are you calling me Puffy for? I had asthma, you dick. But anyway, so I guess I'm tired, so I'm a little getting less.
That's okay.
But the thing is, as far as masks, what I always tell people is this: our people feel very differently. Some people they love the Chiefs. Some people, it pisses them off. For me, I say, call me anything you want to, but just give me back the land. That's the condition. If you want to call me Puffy, call me the Puffy, but give me back the land first.
I think I just want to chime in here. I think it's there's a greater awareness is coming up about the way things have been and how it's hurt people, how names like Lance is talking about, how they've hurt people. And I think so now there's a greater public knowledge is starting to come around about how we need to be more careful. You know, we're starting to understand colonization better. People are writing more about it. It's filtering into the popular culture more. You know, so it comes through with things like the Ioways, you know, and what you guys are doing on the reservation. I think it's exciting that you're exerting some sovereignty over your land, over the way you eat, the way you farm, and things like that. And you see this happening all over the country. So I think it's a really exciting time. Attitudes are changing. People are starting to realize, you know, some of the damage that has been done over the last few hundred years. So, and there's a process to try to understand that more, and then to move on with it. So.
I mean, think about it. I mean, if you think about it, I know people, my grandmother, on the one hand, we called, when I was a little kid, fry bread, we called it squaw bread. That's what we called it. You know, that's why I grew up thinking it was. And it was only in my teens in the 70s that I was corrected about that. But my grandma, you'd call her something like squaw or something, she'd like take your head off. So it's different. If you grew up when you're a kid and you're saying, you're hearing somebody say, yeah, you're nothing but a dirty so-and-so, you're not going to like that name. It's going to make you feel bad and not like that person, right? So if you're saying, yeah, dirty savage, you're a dirty redskin or whatever, why is that an honor? How is that an honor? Hey, chief, how is that an honor if you're saying it in that kind of way? So, you know, people feel differently. Everybody's got their own opinions. I know this, even in our political situation now, you're not going to argue people out of the way they feel. That's fine. But at least try to understand how I feel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And we did have one question from the group, and that was, are there any family IDs on the floral vests? Do you know who those particular vests, what family?
The family usually does. The family's like, well, that's a so-and-so family design. It's the same thing with songs and powwow songs. A lot of them kind of come into general use, but originally, if you want to be really correct, and the older people will say that, certain songs belong to certain families, and only that family can use that song or pass it on to another one for whatever reasons they have to. But people are just kind of looking for inspiration. They're kind of using what they hear, and it's the same thing with these designs. You can look at things, you can look at these designs and get the idea of how they're made, and get the inspiration from the plants and see how people would kind of construct it, then come up with your own design. Don't copy somebody else's design. You don't know what it means. You don't necessarily have the right to do that. But if you look at as an inspiration and say, you know what, this flower kind of looks like this if you hold it on the side and you kind of abstract it, then that's the starting point.
Very nice. Closing thoughts, guys.
Go for it, Greg.
Okay. Well, I think just to repeat what I just said, I think it's really an exciting time, you know, both well, from my point of view, it's really an exciting time to be researching and writing about Native history in Missouri and about Iowa's, and to see culture coming around, like I said, a greater understanding of some of the ways that we've hurt people and maybe some of the ways that might be redressed, you know, in the future, how we might move on. And it's also just exciting to see a lot of the young people taking up traditions, like even in the Iowa Nation, there's a lot of young people now are picking it up, working with the language, working with the arts, you know, doing their own twist on it and things like that. And so I'm mostly optimistic about the future. I think it's exciting.
I would just like to add, we're always interested in people that have bits and pieces of the puzzle of our history and our ways, our land and everything. Each of you may know a little bit of something that we don't have anymore, because our culture was a complete puzzle that somebody knocked off the table, and we're looking for the pieces all the time. There's a really good book about where all the real Indians are dead, and other 20 other myths or something like that. That's how it goes. That gives you a list of some of the common misconceptions people have about Indian people. And of course, one of them often is, how come you guys don't ride horseback? How come you guys don't use tomahawk? How come you guys don't hunt buffalo? How come you, Lance, you look so pale? What's the deal there? Well, if you know our history, you will know that, say, for example, Indian corn. You look speckled Indian corn, you have a blue kernel, you have a red one, you have a yellow one, you have a white one. That's the thing. It's the same year of corn. We're the same people, but some of our kernels are colored a little bit differently.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you, Jackie, for helping organize this. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or you're good, but Lance and Greg, I learned a lot and it was very thorough. And if anyone else has any questions, we can stay on for a few more minutes. But other than that, I really appreciate everybody joining us today. And you can find out about this and other St. Joseph Museum events at our website, stjosephmuseum.org. We would love to have you as a member of the museum if you're interested. And we'll try to work to keep bringing great programs to you and keep doing the research that we do, working with tribes like the Iowa to understand our collection and our history better. And so thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to stick around.
Thank you.
And thanks for the invitation. Yeah.